Hey guys, the history guy here. I am in Tappan, New York, just north of New York City, very near to the Hudson River. And I'm standing in the old cemetery here. Many of these are Revolutionary War era graves. Many of these folks saw some of the most dramatic events of the American Revolution, which took place here in Tappan. One of those took place in the fall of 1778, when the 3rd Continental Light Dragoons were ambushed and killed, many of them killed, in what became known as the Baylor Massacre, or sometimes the Tappan Massacre. One of my ancestors was a member of that unit and was one of the few survivors that day of the Baylor Massacre. The victims of that massacre, the Continental Dragoons, are buried here in this cemetery in unmarked graves, and I'll give you a look at that in just a minute. But it's the other event, which took place almost exactly 2 years later, that most people remember Tappan for. Because it was here that the Continental Army had their headquarters in the fall of 1780, when Benedict Arnold betrayed the Americans and turned over to the British. He was attempting to turn over the fort at West Point, which is just up the Hudson River a few miles from here. He was unsuccessful in doing that, but he did defect, and he did so with the help of the Adjutant General of the British Army. His name was Major John André, and it's his story which is told here in Tappan. After John André was captured, he was brought to Tappan, New York, which was the headquarters of the Continental Army. And he was held in this building behind me, which is an old tavern. It's now known as the 76 House. This was the place that they held André. It was where he was questioned. It was where he readily admitted exactly who he was, that he was the Adjutant General of the British Army, and that he had been meeting with Benedict Arnold and was in the process of turning him, and in fact had been successful in turning him, and said it was an advantage taken in war. Unfortunately for André, he was caught in civilian clothes. He was found with incriminating papers which showed what he was up to, and it was very quickly decided that he would be put on trial. Behind me is the Tappan Reformed Church, and it's on that site that the old Dutch church once stood. And it was that church, which is perhaps 100 yards from where Major André was being held. It was there that George Washington convened his board, who would hear the evidence and decide a verdict for Major André. That board included such prominent figures as Baron von Steuben, Marquis de Lafayette, Nathaniel Greene, most of the highest ranking officers in the Continental Army who was stationed here. And on September 29th, 1780, they heard the evidence that was given from both sides, and they reached a verdict, which was that John André was guilty and should be executed as a spy. After Major André was condemned to death, he was brought up the hill that overlooks the town of Tappan on October 2nd, 1780, to this spot where I'm standing now, where there's a monument today. He began to walk toward the location, and when he saw the noose hanging from the tree, he took a step back. And it was reported that he said something to the effect of, "I'm resigned to my fate, but I detest the mode." André was hoping, and he had appealed to George Washington, that he could be shot as a soldier rather than hanged as a spy. But it was not to be. He came to the spot, he mounted the cart, he put his own noose on, he tied his own napkin handkerchief around his own eyes. It was reported that he said a couple of things. First, he looked at the noose and he said, "It will be but a momentary pang." And then his last words, he said, I pray that you all bear me witness that I died a brave man." It was said that many of the Continental soldiers wept. By all accounts, André had been incredibly brave, had been incredibly charismatic and kind, and was liked by all who met him even his enemies. They very much did not want to have to do what they did, but the Articles of War demanded it. Honor demanded it. More than anything, what Washington wanted was to get his hands on Benedict Arnold, and he would have gladly given up John André to get his hands on Arnold, but that was not the case. After his death, André was buried on this spot where he was hanged. And for 40 years, his body lay in this location until it was exhumed a few years after the Second War between the Americans and the British. His body was sent home to London, and he was interred in a place of honor in Westminster Abbey, where he lies today. This monument was placed here in the 1880s, and it was not without controversy. In fact, the people here were not happy about it. And several attempts were made to destroy the monument. First, it was defaced, it was damaged, but then 2 attempts were made to blow it up. One in 1883, I believe, and the other in 1885. Might have been 1880, the first one. But the second one destroyed the base of this monument, and it was at that point that they finally gave up trying to destroy the monument. And this plaque was placed to honor George Washington and his men. They wanted to make sure that they didn't only honor John André, but they honored the men who captured him and the men who won for America her independence. There you have it, the story of John André here in Tappan, New York. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.